Hello YouTube, welcome back to Kind Heart Homestead. My name is Ben, and I'm here on our off-grid property up in the mountains of Virginia. I have our tri-fuel generator right behind me. I can't get it started. It'll run for about 5 minutes, and then it'll turn off, and then I'll be fighting with it for so long trying to get it to work again before it finally works. But now I can't get it to crank at all. So I've tried a couple different propane tanks, I've topped off the oil, I've done everything I can think of doing, but our batteries need to be recharged. And while I'm standing in the site where the solar array is going to be, that's not quite ready yet. So I'm going to lay down some of this geotextile fabric, the same kind that we used on the driveway. It's actually the same roll, I just haven't used it all yet. I'm gonna lay this down past where our permanent array is going to be so I can hook up a few temporary panels. This is going to be 6 or 7 panels, which is the minimum for our Schneider charge controller. And what I'm hoping to do is cut the wires and things to the appropriate length for the permanent installation so I don't need to buy more, and temporarily hook up these panels just sitting on the ground on top of that fabric, and the fabric will help suppress the weeds from shading out the panels. I know this is not going to be the ideal solution, but we have some 90-degree weather coming here, and we're kind of in a drought, and it's getting pretty hot and dry up here. So in order to get our air conditioning running, we need to have a sustainable recharging mechanism for our battery bank. And I thought that would be our generator, but because it's not working, we just need to figure this out quickly. So bear with me as I try to figure this out, and I hope you enjoy a time lapse of me trying to get these panels into the appropriate place. And then we'll move on from there and see what we can get done. Stick around. Future Ben here. I'm editing this video right now, and I'm kind of combining a lot of footage into one video. And this footage that you're watching right now actually took place around 3 months ago. We actually already have the solar array constructed. So if you want to see that, stay tuned for future videos in the series. But I wanted to let you know that these 7 panels actually worked well for the entire summer. We even had to run the mini split for air conditioning for a couple weeks. So this temporary setup definitely did its job, but we did struggle a bit on some cloudy and stormy weeks with no sun. Well, it's super hot outside, so I'm going to do some work in here. I have this fancy double pole PV isolator, and what I'm going to do is use one of the poles, so that's a positive and a negative, coming from our solar panels, and it's going to allow me to shut it off outside near the panels. And then when the wires go downstream into the charge controller, I can safely work on that end by turning this end off. So this would typically be a pretty simple process, given that wire typically comes plain with no connectors on the ends. But I have a special type of PV cable here, PV standing for photovoltaic. These are special wires that can withstand the harsh deterioration properties of the UV rays coming from the sun. But these ones came with MC4 connectors on them. And I don't have an inverter or any sort of hardware that actually uses the MC4 connectors other than the solar panels. So what I'm doing here is leaving a 1-foot pigtail on any of the wires that I cut, so then I can use both ends. Here's a close-up of the mechanism. This knob has some sort of spring-loaded contraption in it, so it immediately shuts off the PV power. So by cutting the existing PV wire with the MC4 connectors, I essentially turned this back into an extension cord for solar panels with an MC4 connector on both ends, except there's a shutoff right in the middle. So now I need to thread some PV wires down through this conduit temporarily over to the charge controller. I say temporarily because I'm probably going to have to redo this with the permanent array, and most likely have 2 sets of conductors going through because we'll have 2 arrays on our solar ground mount. I'm using this old trick where you tie plastic grocery bag to a string and vacuum it through with a shop vac. Once I got the string, since I was so close to the actual other end of the conduit, I was able to pull the string with one hand while pushing the wires through the conduit with the other hand. That's what you see me doing here. I'm kind of fighting with it because the string has to go around some corners, but I ended up pulling it through, and that should be good enough now for the next few months. Right next to me here is the site of our future solar ground mount installation. I don't know if you can see the string lines, but I have a rectangle representing the lines that the pipes need to be buried into the ground. I have these corner posts beyond the string line that represent the actual edge of the array, because on every side, the solar panels are going to overhang the actual holes. They're essentially cantilevering over. So I need to put a couple more string lines down so I know where to start digging. But I have a feeling today I might need to fire up the auger, see if I can at least start getting some pilot holes dug so I have a good understanding of where all of the posts need to be buried. This is going to take a lot of concrete, a lot of cutting, and I don't really know how I'm going to structure this. I don't know if it's going to be a series or if I'm just going to hold it off till the end. I guess you guys will find out once this airs, but I don't have all the supplies necessary to do this in bulk. I can't just dig a bunch of holes in one day and expect to have enough concrete to fill everything up unless I hired a concrete truck. But I have that Harbor Freight concrete mixer. If you recall, I assembled it on video once. And what my goal is once I start getting into the groove of this situation, to be able to dig one hole, put the appropriate custom cut length pipe in it, and concrete it each day that I decide to do the work. So that's going to require a lot of staging. I'm going to have to get the pipe measurements and everything marked and ready to go. All of the hole locations need to be marked because I'm not just going to dig them all and let them fill up with rainwater and things like that. I only need to dig them once the materials are staged. And then last but not least, the concrete. Each of these holes is probably going to take 5 bags of concrete at least. I think I have 8 in my utility room over there. So I should definitely have enough concrete for one. I also need to figure out how to support the pipe vertically and make sure it's at the exact right elevation. Because there's no way I'm going to dig the holes precisely to a certain depth where the pipe can sit in the bottom and be the correct height. And I'm also not willing to concrete all the pipes in and then cut them to the proper height later. I think what I need to do is build some sort of clamping mechanism that can hold a pipe at the proper height. Make sure it's level before the concrete all cures. So stick around and we'll both figure out together how I'm supposed to get this done. So being such a visual learner, I like to have visual cues to correspond to my measurements so I can kind of step back and imagine the finished solution in my head. So in this case, I'm just scuffing out some turf in each of these hole locations. So when I step back, I can see a little bit of dirt and just kind of reflect on that and visualize how far apart those pipes are going to sit, and I can easily still move the string line without much lost labor. But now I have the laser level set up, because one thing I'm interested in, even though this area looks flat, is what exactly is the height difference between the 4 corners? The answer to that question is only 2 to 3 inches from one end to the other. And an extra couple inches per pipe is well within my tolerances for the materials I plan to purchase. I believe that using this gas-powered auger is more efficient than using a manual post hole digger, but man, this thing does really take a lot of strength and effort to keep under control, especially in our rocky soil conditions. You can see I try to aim the exhaust downwind so I'm not inhaling these fumes. I also am not really wearing any safety glasses, but I do have my earplugs in listening to music because this machine tends to be kind of loud. But I've never had any material fly up from this before, and I used this for an entire fencing project back on our Raleigh homestead. So I am quite familiar with this tool. I just need to keep it maintained with the proper mix of 2-cycle engine oil, gasoline, and fuel stabilizer. I probably need to find another sort of small container to mix those ingredients into though, because the bottle that it came with is a very thin plastic that's already starting to crack in the top corner. This year I did have to replace the fuel lines for this, but it was actually very easy and relatively cheap. You press this little bubble to kind of pressurize the gas tank, and that's what gives it the pressure necessary to get the fuel into the engine. I really don't know much about engines, so you can do research yourself if you're having issues with a 2-cycle engine. But as you can see, I'm going as deep as I can with the 6-inch auger before trying it again with the 8-inch auger, and then getting out the rest of the loose material by hand with a handheld post-hole digger. This is all just the first hole, so there's definitely going to be room for improvement moving on from here. I just measured the depth of the hole so I can add that measurement to the length of the pipe above grade as it shows in my drawing, and then I can finally cut my first piece of 2-inch steel pipe. And I'm going to do that with a reciprocating saw. All right, so behind me is my Harbor Freight concrete mixer, my cut piece of pipe, a bunch of levels, post hole digger, iron tamping rod, and I have my hose and my extension cord here. I think what I'm gonna do is put a bit of concrete in the bottom of the hole before I put the pipe in, and then pour the rest around it while also trying to keep it level. The reason I'm doing that is because I don't have a lot of experience with concrete from the store, and I'm worried about the consistency. If for some reason it's too stiff, I won't be able to slide a pipe down through it like you can with anchor bolts and things like that. So because I'm a novice, I'm gonna just put some concrete in the bottom of the hole and then try to get all my stuff set. So let's see how that works. And I'm doing one hole at a time so I can learn from my mistakes before I move on. As you can see, I went ahead and dug the hole for the second vertical load-bearing support for the solar array. To determine how long that pipe had to be, I simply stepped up on the ladder using my 6-foot level, and I found exactly where level would be. And then I projected my tape measure down into the hole and transferred that number to a pipe. I do have a cut plan, but that's under ideal circumstances with fully level ground, same depth of holes, but I do like to compare it to my cut plan because the cut plan is based on the amount of materials that I need and the amount of materials that I purchased. So I definitely don't want to have pipes much longer than the cut plan because then that would mean I would require more pipe. I just cut the third pipe to length, and now it's time to show you in detail what my process is once again. It's taken me a couple attempts to establish a pretty standard process for casting these pipes in concrete. The first thing is to have the concrete mixer really close by to the site, so I don't have to move wet concrete very far. I have the extension cord and the hose already in place. I also like to bring out my gorilla cart full of the concrete necessary for the job, and basically that's 2 bags plus a portion of another bag using the 80-pound concrete bags. And these are a lot more painful to move than the 50-pound bags. That's another reason why I need to use the cart. But also, it brings the concrete bags up to a more accessible height, so I can actually cut them in half and stage the half bags with the top open, so I can easily lift them and pour them into the concrete mixer. Another trick I learned is to use the wheelbarrow to move the wet concrete instead of trying to dump the concrete mixer straight into the hole. I tried that with the first pipe, and because the pipe is in the way, I end up moving the pipe out of plumb, and that's not a very good technique. That pipe is now complete, so it's time to clean all of my equipment and get the concrete off. Here's a close-up view of my string line just to show my level of precision when installing the first 5 pipes. I just wanted to give a mid-project update. I have 6 out of the 7 back pipes installed. The back pipes being the top of the solar array. The front row is going to be a much shorter leg because of the slope. Right next to me is a hole. Well, why am I digging with a shovel, you might ask, when I have an auger? Over the course of a few of these pipes, I developed a few tricks. The first trick is to over dig the hole. I want the hole to be large enough to where I can put my concrete form tube into the ground. I'm cutting these typically 5 inches deep. And as you can see, I'm not necessarily filling them to the top. I just want to make sure they're above grade so that water can slope away from the pipe. So that explains why the hole's oversized. Why am I digging so deep? Well, I've injured myself on the auger before. If it gets hung up on a rock, that thing's going to rip out of my hand. So what I like to do is dig down as far as I can by hand. Just with the shovel. I'm not going for depth necessarily. I'm really just trying to make sure there's no large rocks towards the surface, and the surface tends to be more problematic than the depth. This entire field behind me is actually drainage field for the septic tank. So at one point when we were out of town, well over a year ago, a professional came here with an excavator. And after he buried all of the infiltrator system and the septic and all that stuff, he backfilled, I guess, with the dirt that he dug out for the septic, and then bulldozed it all over the place. Well, I've been going around over the past year or so, pulling rocks out and putting them into piles so then later on I can move them. All of that is very close to the surface, and I'm building the solar array just on the edge of that field. So there are a lot of loose rocks at the top and not as many at the bottom. So my process so far is to dig by hand, taper it down kind of to a point, and that point should be exactly where the measurement dictates. So these are spaced, on center they're 5'4", but the space between 2 pipes is 5'1" and 5/8 of an inch. So basically I pull the string line, put the tape measure parallel to the string line from one pipe over the hole, and then I try to put a point down, kind of like a little funnel at the bottom. And that acts as a guide for the auger, which is also a point. So when I put that auger down in the hole, it can make a centered hole. You can see this one, very off-center. I didn't develop the technique until I made that mistake. So now I am pretty comfortable having a precise hole in the center of where the measurement needs to be. However, the depth is also problematic. My auger can only go so deep, and I'm pretty sure that's deep enough. But my auger is only 6 inches for Harbor Freight. So I went and bought another one that's 8 inches. But the 8-inch one, I don't know, like using the same motor, it feels like there's so much more torque with the larger auger. I don't know the physics behind that, but that's where I've injured myself in the past, was using that larger auger. So I try to reduce the amount of time I'm using that tool. So I basically drill a pilot hole with a 6-inch auger. And then I chip around with my tamping rod, listening for any rocks. If there's a rock in the sidewall or in the bottom, it's better to go ahead and chisel that out before I swap to the larger auger bit. So then I put the larger auger in, go down the pilot hole. Essentially, I'm just shaving off the edges and all that dirt falls down to the bottom, where I can then remove it with a manual post-hole digger. So I'm really not using the larger auger for that much, but it is the most effective way to widen the hole, other than obviously renting a machine, which would cost more money. I feel like this is pretty sufficient. It's only the very top that's the 12-inch width, but so far each of these holes is taking about 2¼ bags of concrete, and those are the 80-pound bags. But I'm hoping this is going to be strong enough. You know, we have a lot of wind here, and I'm worried about the uplift more than anything. So I'm going to get back to work now, finish off this last pipe on the back row before I move to the front row. I like to use my gorilla cart to reduce the amount of steps I have to take while carrying an 80-pound concrete bag. And because this thing has such big wheels, it's pretty easy to get out of this little graded area I have and over to the construction area. The hardest part of all of this is getting an 80-pound bag off of the floor. So it's actually easier when they're up on top of the stack like they are here. And since all I need is 2¼ bags per hole, I tend to keep an open bag that I just use for that extra remainder. So now I need to stage the rest of the materials and tools that I need for this process, which includes a ladder, a bungee cord, and a level. I'll show you in a minute what I'm going to do with each of those. All right, I explained the process for digging the holes, but what I haven't explained is how I determine the length of the pipe. I do have a cut plan that, under ideal conditions, everything being level and plumb and everything like that, what length all of the pipes should be. So that's a general guideline. But with the sloped terrain, and with the fact that all the tops of the pipes is what matters, the depth is different. Or should I say the length of these pipes is different. So I'm going to show you how I use a level and a tape measure to determine the height of the pipe. First, start by taking this little cap off. I just keep these on to keep the water out in case it rains. This is a 6-foot level, and because the spacing is 5'4" on center. This is actually long enough to place across two pipes to make sure they're level. Without a pipe being there, I'm going to substitute it with a tape measure measured vertically down into the bottom of the hole. That's how I will get my measurement. So this next pipe has to be 112 inches long. You can keep wooden posts aligned using wooden boards and stakes as a kickstand, but for metal pipes I had to get a bit creative. So I'm using this 8-foot ladder in conjunction with a basic bungee cord to essentially hold this post upright just long enough to get a couple bags of concrete down into the hole. At that point, the weight of the concrete holds the pipe upright, but I still like to keep the level on it until the concrete is cured, just in case I have to make any minor adjustments. You'll notice I got out the extension cord to power our electric concrete mixer, but I do need to tweak this vertical post just a bit. Even though I had it perfectly level and the height was correct, the spacing between the new post and the previous post was not where it needed to be. And the trickiest part about this whole thing is that there's nothing to actually hold the bottom of the post a certain distance from the edge of the hole, so even when I pour concrete in, it could slightly move it. The bungee cord really doesn't lock it into any sort of position. It just sort of holds it relatively plumb. You can see I have a bit of a mask on, a sort of just a bandana that I use to keep the dust out of my respiratory system. They say that silica dust is really bad for you. So here I go, pouring one bag at a time into the concrete mixer, putting an appropriate amount of water in there to allow it to pour down the hole, and then I try to remove some of the air bubbles by shoving a stake up and down several times through the wet concrete. That does help settle it down, make it a bit flatter before the next pour, and any sort of spillage that's gone around the outside of the hole, I also push it down into the hole. It's not until I get the concrete pretty close to grade that I insert the cardboard tube. And this is a form tube that I cut into 4 to 5 inch strips, and it doesn't matter if I fill the concrete all the way up to the top as long as it's above grade. And that's where the extra quarter of a bag comes in handy, because 2 bags by itself might barely make it to grade, depending on how many boulders I had to pull out of the sidewall. And then after I pour the concrete, I immediately try to clean up all of the concrete tools, because dried concrete is notoriously difficult to remove. I'm cleaning out all of the concrete over the construction area, which will eventually be concealed by landscape fabric and stones. I'm definitely trying to keep wet concrete out of the septic drainage field. Now I just have to double check my levels and put the top caps back on. And now I need to establish layout for the front legs of our solar array. You can see I have some pink string line out that I need to untangle, but I have plenty of these concrete stakes out that allow me to easily move my string lines from place to place as long as I have a mallet nearby. I'm using my drawing as reference to know how far to put the string line from the back row of posts that I've already installed. It doesn't really matter what that distance is as long as it's parallel. I'm also establishing a perpendicular string line so I know exactly where the first post of the second row needs to be. My carpenter square is an easy, quick reference to estimate square, but to actually calculate it, I need to determine the hypotenuse and measure. Due to my back injury, I asked for Angie's help to move the top rails into place. One of these is a full 21-foot pipe with threads on both ends. The other one just spans the rest of the array and is only threaded on one side. And these pipes come with couplers, so you can easily screw them together as long as you can reach it. And then this is how the fastening mechanism works with my Iron Ridge hardware to connect the top rail to the upright vertical posts that support the back of the array. So back to the first hole on the front row of the solar array. You can see here a perfectly dug hole. You can see all the tamping marks at the bottom. Here is a close-up of the bottom of the hole. I'm laying my level across the ground to establish grade, and using the tape measure, I can clearly see how deep the hole is. Using my drawing as a reference, I can add the above grade height to the below grade height to come up with the exact length that this pipe needs to be. After cutting that to length, I can set it in the hole. And now here's a new technique I developed to determine where the next pipe needs to go. I'll go ahead and explain that technique right now.
All right, I'm on my final 2 holes for this entire project. And I wanted to slow things down just a bit to explain how I square up my second row of pipes. I need a 6-foot level framing square. I might need a tape measure and a rock. And you might need a blade to remove excess concrete form tube. We just had a massive storm, so I can actually just rip off what I need there. And I'll show you why that's necessary in a second. So using my 6-foot level, I'm able to span between 2 of these pipes because the spacing between them is only 5'1" and 5/8, give or take 3/4 of an inch. So now that I have my parallel line, I need to establish a perpendicular line. That's where the square comes in. There. Now the rock will hold that in place while I remove the level and extend the plane from the square to my other string line. And then the tape measure is just to double check. I'm going to measure the spacing between this pipe and then that one. It's not really necessary because I'd rather it just be squared up perpendicular than match the spacing. If you look at my design, you'll notice that the 2 top rails need to be parallel. The spacing of the support pipes that hold up the top rail isn't really that important. It's more aesthetic than anything because the vertical posts don't align with anything above them necessarily. My original design had a vertical post between every row of solar panels, but to increase strength, I added an extra support pipe. So instead of 2 rows of 6, it's 2 rows of 7. Well, that's exactly 5'1" and 5/8. I'm going to measure the other one, and I'm going to start digging now.
Another trick I developed throughout this project was a technique to remove the dirt as I go. I like to keep the top piece of turf intact, and then I go and put it in a big hole from where I removed a boulder from the surface of the septic field. And then when I hand dig the rest of the hole before I use the auger, I like to fill up the wheelbarrow since I don't need it for concrete at this point. As you can see, I'm moving the wheelbarrow from place to place. Anywhere I have like a low spot or water puddles or any holes from digging out rocks, I'm bringing that over and putting the dirt immediately into a place where it can be used. That way, as it rains, hurricane season is here, so we're getting a lot of rain, and I'm letting that rain just kind of regrade some of these low areas that we have using that dirt. It's also nice to have the dirt out of my project space, so it gives me more room to work. If I left all the dirt till the end, it would be a pain to remove it because of all the poles and different things that could be in the way. And it would also take an unnecessary amount of digging all at once, and I'd rather spread out that task across the duration of this project. I know this is getting pretty redundant, but I just wanted to emphasize how efficient this routine has become. I'm hand digging at first, using the 6-inch auger, upgrading to the 8-inch auger, and then finally cutting the pipe to length and concreting it in place. And speaking of concrete, I realized I hadn't shown you a close-up of how I process the concrete bags to make it easier to move them into the mixer. You can see I use a clean, sharp razor blade, to score across the top and the sides of the bag, making a horizontal cut. And then I lift carefully and fold the bag in half. The trick here is trying not to spill the concrete. So what I do is I use my gloved fingers to slide the concrete dust away from the paper that has remained that kind of bridges the two halves. And once I get the concrete off of that, I can bring the blade up from the back and slice it. That's the trickiest part that I hadn't really mastered until the end. I had been trying to cut the bags apart from the top, and I guess because of how dusty and dirty the paper is on the inside, the razor blade just doesn't go through it. So you really have to squeeze your hand in between those two bags, hope you can get as far to the middle as you can, and then proceed with it again on the other side. So now instead of 2 80-pound bags, I essentially have 4 40-pound bags, which is a lot more manageable. And now, since I'm in the process of doing some close-ups, I'll show you how I cut the concrete form tubes. At first I was measuring 5 inches, but what I realized quickly was you can't actually see the line when you're using a reciprocating saw because there's a little plate that obscures the Sharpie mark. So what I'm doing now is measuring a 4-inch line, and then I'm aligning that line with the edge of that plate, which is offset about 1 inch. So I'm actually cutting a full 5-inch piece of tube. The reason I measured from the other end is because that's the factory end, and I trust that a lot more than measuring off of previously cut edge. Since we're on this spree of close-ups, here is the concrete mixer in action. I highly recommend protecting your lungs from this concrete dust. But once you get it watered down, you can take off the mask because the wet concrete really doesn't get into the air like the dry stuff does. So as you can see here, I'm repeating the process that you've seen multiple times already. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is I have a brand new torpedo level. That's that little red one that I have vertically on the pole. It actually has some magnets built in. That's a feature I've never had before, but if you're going to be putting metal pipes into the ground, I definitely recommend that. If you were using wooden posts that were squared off, like a fence post, you can actually buy a cheap little level that kind of wraps around the edge and it gives you your plumb lines on 2 sides. That would be a lot easier than this. With this one, I have to wrap it around the side to check plumb in 2 directions, but this is definitely doable, especially since I'm only adding 1 pipe in the ground per day. So you can see here, my 6-foot level makes another cameo. It spans across the 2 pipes and I can make sure that they're level. Using a level for each pipe does have a bit of a variation going across because the bubble might not be perfect. This is a pretty cheap Harbor Freight level, but if you really consider the precision necessary to install a solar panel, which isn't really that precise to begin with, having this fluctuate maybe 1 inch or so from one end to the other really doesn't make that much of a difference. I'm moving on here to the last pipe. I'm using the same technique, but I have to remove the stake to have room to work. So you see me holding the string line occasionally, pulling it tight to see how many of the posts it can touch at the same time, and I'm just trying to get it somewhere within 1 inch of that string. That's all the precision I'm really hoping for. I made an effort this last one just to wrap up this project, so I'm actually doing 2 holes on the last day instead of 1. I got the last bag of concrete from the store, so I'm trying to use all that I have left. That's why this last post does not have a concrete form.
Well, I'm finally done with this phase of our solar array project. It's taken me probably around 2 months to get all of these posts securely concreted into the ground, but that's mainly due to a back injury where I had to take a month and a half off, and I was just taking it easy. But now this is done, and I'm pretty excited because that is the hard part. Lifting these 80-pound concrete bags has been very intense, which has pretty much limited me to 1 hole a day, but I was able to knock out these 2 just on the last one, and I'm slightly short on concrete. I wasn't able to get a circular riser, but I'm pretty confident that this is going to dry slightly above grade, and regardless, this is not an engineered solution, but I did upgrade it slightly over my original design just to make it a bit stronger because of the wind that we have up on the mountain here. I just wanted it to have slightly more weight. Each of these holes was filled with 2 1/4 80-pound bags. If my calculations are correct, that's 200 pounds of concrete per hole, plus the weight of these pipes. Obviously, the taller pipes on the back row are going to be heavier because they're approximately twice the length. I'm shooting for a 35-degree angle. Let me know down in the comments if you have experience, at least in this part of the world, the Northern Hemisphere, if you think it's a good idea to target more of the spring and fall angle and more towards the winter angle than the summer. We're doing that strategically because the days are shorter, which means less solar production in general, but also because we're going to be using electricity for heat. We're actually going to have higher demand in the winter. And that's one of the reasons why this is at the top of my list of things to get done before the winter.
So the hard part's done. Now I just need to clear out this construction zone to make sure it's flat for the next phase of the project. On the next episode, you'll get to see me install geotextile fabric to suppress weeds, finally unbox and install some of my Iron Ridge hardware that will allow me to connect the top rail and the bottom rail to the solar panels. I'm also going to start installing those panels as well. If you have any sort of interest in a DIY solar installation, or if you're just intrigued about solar in general, I recommend you go ahead and subscribe to the channel here, and I'll see you back here next time on Kind Heart Homestead. Thanks for watching.